In 1958, the Chinese government made a decision that seemed completely reasonable at the time. An order was given to eliminate sparrows across the entire country. Why? The government believed that these small birds were eating large amounts of grain every year, and if they were removed, crop production would increase, food supplies would grow, and the country would be able to produce more grain. But just a few months later, something happened that almost no one could have imagined. The very decision that was made to protect crops was later linked to a disaster that affected the lives of millions of people. This is the full story of that decision. China in 1958. This was a time when the country was undergoing major economic and agricultural changes. The government was led by Mao Zedong, and its goal was to rapidly increase agricultural and industrial production. During this period, a large national campaign was launched called the Four Pests Campaign. The purpose of this campaign was to reduce the population of creatures that were considered harmful to public health or agricultural production at the time. These included rats, flies, mosquitoes, and a specific type of sparrow known as the Eurasian tree sparrow. At that time, it was widely believed that these sparrows consumed large amounts of grain from farms. According to some government estimates, reducing their numbers could significantly increase crop production. Based on this belief, an unusual nationwide campaign was launched. The campaign did not only involve government organizations. School students, government workers, rural communities, and city residents all became part of it. People would bang pots, beat drums, and create loud noises to force sparrows to keep flying until they became exhausted and fell to the ground. In many places, their nests were destroyed, eggs were removed, and large numbers of sparrows were killed. The campaign spread rapidly across the country. At first, it appeared that the plan was working. The sparrow population was declining quickly, and the government believed that crops would now be safer than before. But one important fact had been ignored, a fact connected to the balance of nature. And just a few months later, the consequences of this quiet mistake began to appear across the country. At first, the government believed that the plan had been successful. The number of sparrows was rapidly decreasing, and it was expected that more grain would now be preserved for human consumption. But nature does not work around just one problem. Every living creature has a role, and when an important link in that chain suddenly disappears, the results can be unexpected. Just a few months later, farmers began noticing a strange change. Locusts, caterpillars, and other crop-eating insects started appearing in much larger numbers than before. At first, people considered it a normal agricultural problem, but soon, it became clear that this was not just a temporary change. The insect population continued to grow. The real problem was that the sparrows, which were seen only as grain-eating pests, were actually also consuming large numbers of these harmful insects. When their population suddenly dropped, the natural control over these insects was also removed. Now, there was almost nothing stopping them. As a result, the insects began attacking crops on a much larger scale. Where the government had expected higher crop production, many regions began suffering severe agricultural damage. Rice, wheat, and other crops faced increasing insect attacks. Farmers worked day and night, but in many fields, the harvest remained far below expectations. This situation was not limited to just one village or one province. Reports of similar problems began coming from different parts of the country. However, historians also point out that the crisis of this period was not caused only by the removal of sparrows. During the same era, changes in agricultural policies, unrealistic production targets, local administrative problems, and poor weather conditions in some regions also played a role. All of these factors combined to make the agricultural crisis much more severe. That is why most researchers today agree that eliminating sparrows disrupted the ecological balance. But the later crisis was the result of multiple causes, not just a single decision. As time passed, food shortages began to increase. In many areas, people struggled to obtain even basic food supplies. The government also began realizing that the problem was far more complicated than it had originally believed. Once again, nature had shown that even a small change in an ecosystem can create consequences far beyond what anyone expects. But the most difficult period was still ahead. The shortage of food was beginning to turn into a major human crisis, and the government was forced to reconsider its decision. The number of sparrows had already declined. Insect attacks were increasing. Crops were being affected, but the real crisis had not yet reached its full intensity. Soon, different parts of China began experiencing severe food shortages. And then, this problem was no longer just about agriculture. It was turning into a major human crisis. Between 1959 and 1961, China experienced one of the worst famines in modern history. Severe food shortages emerged in many regions. Millions of families struggled to obtain the basic food supplies they needed for daily life. Conditions were especially difficult in many rural areas, where crop failures directly affected people's survival. Historians agree that this famine did not have a single cause. Multiple factors contributed to the crisis. Changes in agricultural policies, inaccurate local reporting, unrealistic production targets, poor weather conditions in some regions, and disruptions to the ecological balance all combined to make the situation much worse. That is why most researchers describe this event as a multi-factor crisis, rather than the result of a single decision. During this period, experts and local officials also began recognizing another important fact. The sparrow, which had been viewed only as a grain-eating enemy, was actually a natural predator of many insects that damaged crops. When its population rapidly declined, insect numbers increased in many areas, adding another layer of difficulty to the existing agricultural problems. A link in nature's chain had been removed, and now the entire system was feeling the effects. The government gradually began reconsidering this policy. Later, changes were made to the Four Pests Campaign, and sparrows were removed from the list. Another harmful insect was added instead, while agricultural strategies were also adjusted. This change showed that some important factors had been overlooked in the original decisions. But the damage that had already occurred could not be reversed immediately. Affected regions needed time to recover. Efforts were made to restore balance in the agricultural system, and various reforms were introduced in the following years. This event became an important example of the connection between ecosystems and agricultural planning. Today, when scientists and experts examine this event, they do not focus only on sparrows. They also emphasize that every living creature has a role in nature, and that major decisions must consider the entire ecosystem before being implemented. That is why this event is still discussed today in conversations about environmental science, agriculture, and policymaking. But one final chapter of this story remains. The chapter where we will explore what the world learned from this event and why it is still considered an important historical lesson today. China had changed its policy. The campaign against sparrows had ended, and over time, agricultural strategies also began to change. But this event did not remain limited to Chinese history. Today, it is still discussed around the world as an important example, because it highlighted one fundamental truth. The natural world is far more complex than we often expect. According to modern environmental science, every living creature, no matter how small, plays a role in its ecosystem. Some animals help with plant reproduction, some control the populations of other species, while others help break down dead organic matter. If any one of these links is suddenly removed, the effects can spread throughout the entire system. That is why experts today carefully study the possible consequences of major environmental decisions before taking action. The 1958 campaign in China became an important example of this principle. The initial idea was that reducing the number of grain-eating birds would lead to larger harvests. But later, it became clear that these same birds also consumed many insects that damaged crops. A single species can play several different roles in nature, and if a decision is made by looking at only one aspect, the outcome can turn out very differently from what was expected. Today, historians and experts also emphasize that the famine between 1959 and 1961 was not caused by a single factor. Agricultural policies, administrative decisions, weather conditions, and environmental changes all contributed to the crisis. That is why understanding this event requires looking at the complete picture rather than focusing on only one factor. This balanced perspective is now widely accepted in modern research. Over time, China made various changes to its agricultural policies and environmental strategies. science also began placing greater focus on why maintaining natural balance is essential. Today, many countries consider not only crops but also birds, insects, soil, and the entire ecosystem when planning agricultural systems. In 1958, few people could have imagined that a decision involving a small bird would become one of the most discussed environmental examples in history. But this event showed one important lesson. In nature, even things that seem insignificant at first can sometimes play a vital role. A small bird, a government decision, and a historical lesson that the world continues to study today. This was the story of China's 1958 Four Pests Campaign and the campaign against sparrows, a story that reminds us that the effects of major decisions can often be far greater than we initially expect.